Hello and welcome to Back to Britpop. It's me, Chris. On this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Arnold. Tim Arnold is a very successful musician and songwriter and producer, and formed the band Jocasta back in 1994. They had some great success with 2 singles and an album with Sony, but he's been incredibly busy ever since and writing lots of music and getting involved in lots of musical projects. It's a really fascinating chat with Tim, and I really appreciate him talking to me. Just before we get on to the interview, just a quick reminder of things that you can do to support me and the podcast. Just make sure you follow me on social media and get involved on the chat over there. So just search for Back to Britpop on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. And also, if you have time, write a quick review on Apple and give me a 5-star rating, because that will really help in terms of getting the podcast listened to by a bigger audience. And then finally, if you want to support me financially, you can buy me that virtual coffee on the Ko-Fi page, which is in the show notes. That's enough waffle from me until the end, obviously. So here's Tim. Welcome to the podcast, Tim Arnold. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Chris?
Yeah, bearing up under the strain of everything going on. So yeah, whereabouts are you?
At the moment, I'm in London and in leafy Muswell Hill, which is where I've lived for the last 5 years.
Well, Tim, I mean, the podcast is me looking back at the 90s, essentially, the bands I was into. Jocasta was the band that you formed. Before that, obviously, you were obviously keen in music, but how was that seed sown with regards to music and playing and influences and things?
Gosh, it's a really weird journey, mine, but I'll try to do a potted version of it. But my mum's a singer and was very much a kind of 60s it girl singer, and was a presenter on Ready Steady Go and worked with the Beatles and the Stones and all that sort of stuff. So there's an argument that would say that it's in my DNA to a degree, although I didn't really know that when I was growing up. I wasn't really aware of just how much she'd been a part of that scene. And we lived in Spain from when I was, 9 years old. And I'd started writing instrumental music. I was really into prog when I was like 10, 11 years old.
Yeah.
I'd started, I'm self-taught, I've never gone to music school or anything like that, or really had many lessons. So I was just experimenting with keyboards and making my own tape albums when I was 11 or 12. And then I moved back to England at probably around the time I realized that my mother had been part of that amazing scene that I'd fallen in love with, which was everything to do with the 1960s music culture, particularly the London music culture. And I came back to England and got myself enrolled into a Rudolf Steiner school, only because they were sort of accepting of vegetarians, and I've been a vegetarian all my life. And when my mother got the sad news from me when I was 13, I was like, I'm not living here in the Costa del Sol anymore. I need to go back to England, Slightly precarious, but genuinely upset as well, not being sort of where I thought I was going to be. And she said, well, you better write to the Vegetarian Society. So that's how I ended up at the Rudolf Steiner School. And I don't know if you know about those schools, but they're pretty amazing in terms of art. I think a lot of musicians and actors have come and gone through those schools. So I set up Jocasta as a response to my friendship with the lead guitarist of the band, Jack Reynolds. When I was 16, we'd been playing together in class breaks,
Yeah.
And that was right at the start of the 90s. And it was sort of, we were into the Pixies and Red House Painters, Jane's Addiction, and hadn't quite discovered what was going on in London. But we did end up sort of making friends with the whole Setanta crowd, and Divine Comedy and Edwyn Collins, and that was, as a 16-year-old kid, that was like my introduction into the London scene.
How did you start writing music then?
I started writing songs in Spain just before I left and coming to England. I was writing music and long, epic Mike Oldfield style 22-minute pieces of music on keyboards and using like old double cassette players, which I'd loop round and keep bouncing. So I'd worked out multi-tracking when I was 13, and but I'd never wanted to sing ever, and I'd never wanted to kind of do what my mum does, which is be an entertainer and the sort of focal attention of the audience. I just wanted to make music, but I had started writing poetry as well, so I had a lot of poems. And then I discovered John Lennon, and somebody sent me a book of the meanings of all his songs. And I think around that time, I thought I should probably put some of the poetry I've written to music, you know, and that's what I did.
Was that whole frontman thing then quite difficult for you to sort that role? Quite difficult for you to get into?
Well, I think role is the operative word. I think we had a singer, one of our school friends was singing in the band at first, but everybody else had said, these don't sound like, the songs aren't sounding like the way you've written them, Tim. I think you need to sing it yourself. So when I started, and we were in Hertfordshire and playing gigs in places like Watford and Hemel Hempstead, you know, I had a lot of hair and I used to sing my songs very passionately, but behind my hair. And you know, it was still when Richard from Verve had long hair, so it was kind of cool. You know, we hadn't got to the Britpop mod cut yet. So 91, 92, all the fop from Suede, you know, none of that started. So it was still kind of cool to look like a slightly hippie-ish mystical character, and that was great because I was really shy, to be honest. And I covered it up with a lot of angst and what seemed like aggression, but I mean I wasn't aggressive at all, really.
And so when you start getting a following then, how did that come about, gigs and things? Following
really did start in Hemel Hempstead. We had amazing support from friends from school and their friends, and that there seemed to be an interesting scene going on. I think mainly with Hemel Hempstead, it was because there was this venue called the Pavilion, where a lot of bands, it was on the main circuit. So we'd seen the Manic Street Preachers there, and you know, all the bands that had just been signed were on the front page of the NME or the Melody Maker. So there was this sense of a scene there starting because of it being so close to London as well, I suppose. And then I think what happened when I moved to London, the rest of the band moved to London first, and then I followed after doing my A-level in art. And they supported us anyway in coming to London. I think it was really nice. We didn't ever do the coach thing. A lot of bands were getting their mates on coaches to come to London and do gigs, because in those days, of course, there was the sort of you must have this many people and then you'll start to get paid for the gig and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, you know. And I seem to remember writing as many kind of, I don't know, as many sort of mathematical equations about how to fund the gigs as I was writing songs at the time. It was so weird looking back on it now, but it was a big part of that time, you know. I think before I played all the regular venues like the Bull and Gate and the Falcon and Splash Club and Underworld, I'd checked out that these were the places to play, you know, and I think which was quite young, I suppose, and as a returning Londoner, I was only 17 or something, but I did work that template. It was a lovely path. There was when you decided that that's what you wanted to do, you know, either be a songwriter or a singer or in a band or a recording artist. In those days, and you made the decision, that's what I'm going to do. There were some great guides, you know. So I think it's harder now. I mean, in that sense, I think there's a lot more you've got to work out. I think there's more information, but less curation, if you know what I mean.
I mean, how long did it take for you to get some sort of record label interest?
We were completely signed to Sony, but I think they positioned it as if we weren't at first because it was cool in those days to be a major or whatever. I look at it now like whatever. But it took us from the moment we really decided we have to get a deal. It was that thing. Everybody we knew, all our mums and dads, those that had them, and friends and partners were like, "Are you signed yet?" You know, it was such a massive deal. And I think for me, pressure, I started to feel there was something wrong with me because I wasn't signed. And I was pretty tenacious, and I just knew that we could get signed. And I think it was mainly because with the band, there were a lot of different members of the band at Jocasta until it became what was the lineup that got signed. But I knew with that lineup that I was starting to hear the songs in real life in the way that I'd imagined them when I wrote them. And I thought, this is really special, you know. And I think a lot of that's got to do with my musical relationship with Jack and also the rhythm section, who were a little bit older than us and more experienced and just so good, you know, Adrian and Andy. And I think really it took us about a year. We rehearsed like dogs for 6 months in this terrible rehearsal studio. I say terrible, it wasn't terrible, it was brilliant, but not posh or anything, you know.
Yeah,
it was. We loved it, and we really worked so hard without playing a gig ever for 6 months, I think. And then after that, we went out. We played 6 gigs and got signed.
That must have been an amazing feeling to have all that hard work and pressure and responsibility. Well, not responsibility, but you felt like you had your end goal in sight, and then to get, you know, it was, it was amazing at the time, and it's still amazing, and I think more amazing now in a way because it was a reward on merit. You know, which I'm sure all bands since the Beatles and the 90s have, but it's slightly different. There's not a lot of reward for actual merit in the ecosystem of music that we find ourselves in today. Yeah.
It's sort of the opposite a lot of the time. I find the better the material that we make, sometimes the harder it is to find proper industrial support for, but that's only my experience. But yeah, it was so lovely, and in that way that some people would say that, you know, doesn't matter if you're signed or doesn't matter if that, but it was a really beautiful experience to be in a major label like Sony and kind of be taken into a room where you can see all the other bands that they own, which is like Primal Scream's over here and Oasis is over there, and there's Bob Dylan too. You know, it was like it was a really. I was 19, so I just really did feel like this is what I've been working towards.
And then the record did quite well. You had a couple of singles, and
the album didn't do well, but everything before it did. Yeah, the singles did. Yeah, it was lovely. I still remember us coming back from a tour. A mini tour we did. We were playing with Octopus and Manson in Belgium, and then we got the ferry back to Dover, and the guys at the passport office or whatever said, "Who are you? What are you doing?" And they'd heard our single go on the radio, you know, those kind of things, which I guess doesn't happen anymore because of the internet. You know, there's no sort of passing coincidence of we've heard your song. It's not such a big deal, is it now? But stuff like that was really magical, I think, for all of it, certainly for me.
I guess like many stories and many bands from that era, that it doesn't always go according to plan in terms of like a follow-up second album and then, you know, releases. It had a couple of re-releases, didn't you? They re-released or repackaged the album with the singles and things.
No, they varied the entire thing. I re-released it. No, Sony have vast amnesia when it comes to Jocasta. It was a weird time, and I think I was talking about this with my partner Kate the other day because we watched 24-Hour Party People, and watching that, I realised that I'd begun my career in music a little bit after the big boom of the early 90s. And it was, we just got in there before the Spice Girls came along and said guitars are not cool anymore. You know, it was a weird time. And looking at it now, I mean, because of this, what I've done as a solo artist has been all the things that I would have probably done with Jocasta. But I realised they would not have been possible in that sort of deal.
Since Jocasta, since the end, you kind of called it a day back at sort of late end of the 90s and sort of beginning of the noughties?
Yeah, well, I lost myself completely. I mean, losing the deal to me was probably a much bigger thing than for the rest of the band in terms of they obviously had their families here, and I think I viewed the whole thing as psychologically as the band and the label were my family, and lots of therapy later you realize no, this was a profession. This was not meant to be the bedrock of your emotional security. And of course I was too young, to be honest, but it took me I don't know 5 or 6 years to get through the whole drugs and rock and roll bullshit that so many of us go through. So that my generation, to kind of get on with it and go, oh no, okay, back to plan A, make shitloads of albums. and that's what I've done ever since, and it's that funniest thing is I find it so charming that the fans of Jocasta remember the band and the album, which I'm really proud of. But to be honest, I'm not as proud of it as I am of the stuff I've done since, and that have involved some of the members of Jocasta as well. But because it didn't really begin my career. It was like it's a weird episode that happened, and then I was off out of the scene for a long time, and then I started really in the early 2000s.
How did you go about then, sort of getting some sort of manifesto for what your ideas, getting everything down and having a kind of plan of action? Because you've done so much since that time, haven't you? And you've with regards to sort of publishing, and then the Save Soho campaign you're doing, and working with. I
just build worlds. I realized quite early on that I think you've got to do what makes you happy. And what makes me happy, and I'm just doing it again at the moment, is writing the songs, putting them together, sequencing them, creating the artwork, and even doing all the ISRC numbers and all the rest of it that you have to do to make sure that if there's any remuneration that you're going to get it. I love doing that so much. And I started doing that with cassettes when I was 12, It's album making, long form storytelling with music. And in the midst of that, not having funding, not being able to tour, not being able to go abroad, and it really has made me focus on my locality. And people say, wow, such a great idea to do. I think they assume that I'm some sort of, I don't know, rich celeb type person that decides, I'll make a concept album about Soho. The truth is that I just made the best thing I could out of where I was, I can walk to the places and interview people about their life stories, and I can learn about the history because I'm living in it, and that's how the Soho Hobo album happened, which is still, I think that's like my 15th album, but I think that's the one that then in the UK made people go, oh right, yeah, him, which is really nice.
So what's happening now then? What are you working on at the moment?
I released my proper last album in November, and I probably should be working that, but I don't really know how to at the moment. But that came out in November, and which I love, and I want to do a lot more with, and then I just released a live album, which is called Tales from the Tracks, which is actually talks a lot about all the Britpop years in it. It's a kind of I did about 6 gigs before and after all the lockdowns last year when we were allowed to. So I did 6 socially distant gigs and turned them into sort of a half life story and half gig. So there are songs from all the different periods of my career, and then me talking about the songs and whether or not I was, halfway down a flight of stairs at the Astoria, drunk out of my mind, or in a Buddhist monastery in Thailand meditating. It's fun. It's fun, and because I recorded them not really knowing why, other than this is a bit of history. I've never done gigs in the middle of a pandemic before, where I'm measuring spaces between seats for the audience. It's nuts. So I thought, it's kind of special. So I recorded them all, and then put them together. So I just released that last week.
I guess you're going to be then sort of putting your mind to trying to write more songs, and would you be then thinking about, you know, reflecting on the current state of affairs and what the pandemic and things?
Well, I did that with When Staying Alive's the latest craze, that my 20th album, the one that I wrote in the first lockdown. So I've kind of done that, and I've at the moment, it's a lie to say I'm not writing. I am writing, but I've already got the next album ready to go. So I'm sort of constantly it's a weird cycle. As I'm putting a record out, there's another one ready to come out after, and I'm writing stuff for the one that will come next. It's got to that stage now, but that's because, essentially I'm unemployed and I don't work with many other people. You suddenly, I don't think, Chris Martin wouldn't be able to do that, because there's so much expectation, isn't there, when you're a global success. But if you're kind of, you've got a loyal but small fan base, and they are scattered across the globe. But I don't have that issue of we've got to sell and sing this for another 500 years. I don't, and I couldn't do that either, which is why I said I would never manage another year with Sony anyway. The whole concept of playing the same stuff forever, I think, is nuts. The Beatles didn't do it,
Yeah.
That was always my feeling. It was like, 6 months an album, that sounds fair enough. What else are you meant to be doing, unless it's just all about the industry. And I've never been really a part of the industry. I brush shoulders with people in it, but I'm just not in it.
Well, Tim, I look forward to seeing whatever you do next, and I really appreciate you talking to me about Jocasta and your influences and everything you've done.
Pleasure, man. And really great, I think, that for those bands from the Britpop years that you're giving a kind of where are they now sort of thing. I think that's really nice, really lovely, because there's some amazing artists from that time. I'm looking forward to listening to some of your episodes.
Thanks so much, Tim. Take care.
All right, Chris. Take care, man.
Take care. Bye. Thanks again to Tim for joining me on the podcast. The guy is incredibly busy, so it was really, really great to pin him down for a half an hour chat. Thanks again for all your support, the listens, the downloads, and the sharing is really appreciated. The podcast is doing incredibly well, and it's all down to you guys and your support. That's it from me. I'll see you on the next podcast.